Good evening. It's fantastic to see all of you. Welcome to you who could enter the room. Sorry that we couldn't let everybody in. It's a pity, but the lecture can be followed on a second auditorium. So most welcome also for those who follow us on distance. And I hope everybody found a seat and will enjoy the evening. It's a great delight, a very special moment to have tonight such a great architect, Norman Foster, among us. And as you may know, we celebrate tonight a new connection between our school and Norman Foster. It's the Droneport project called Red Line. It's a big honor, Norman, to welcome you on board. Welcome to our campus. And I'm sure it will be a fantastic experience, and thank you to share this significant challenge with us. The Red Line was incubated at EPFL. It's a project that is developed by many other institutions, including ETH, and it's at a very early stage, so you are the first to hear about it. So before the lecture, Jonathan Ledgard, who is the driving force behind this project, will give an introduction on it. Tonight, the highest interest in humanitarian needs and robotic development will meet the highest level in architecture. But highest not only in terms of groundbreaking buildings, but because when Norman Foster does architecture, it goes way beyond the building itself. I would like to point out the significant role Norman played in the recognition of the profession at a very large scale. He always stated that he rejects the distinction between what is architecture as high art and what is regarded as a mere building, saying that it moves totally the impact one can have on the built environment. Architecture becomes a whole system that goes from economic needs to social issues, value, history, and conservation, the flexibility that we need in today's life. And Norman Foster thinks from the door handle to the city master plan. His systemic and his holistic approach has left a huge impact on the practice of architecture. It is especially important for us, for our school, the ENAC, which aims to bring together architects, civil engineers, and environmental engineering. For our generation, Norman Foster is a model fully in tune with this kind of fluent relationship one must have now developed between all these different issues. And quite often, he mentioned his legacy to Buckminster Fuller, the architects, designer, inventor of systems, and it's quite original because not many architects refers to Fuller, and this may be the origin of the very early understanding of Norman Foster for the efficiency of resource use. Fuller was one of the early environmentalist activists. He was the first green architect. But he had an intuition to the future, but he was into science fiction, so to speak. And Norman Foster is a pioneer who brings intuition into reality. All these issues like energy consumptions, sunlight, flexibility, land use, have been at a very early worry to Norman Foster in his work, but he made it part of his design. It's not a constraint. It really serves the project. So then tonight, I go back to the title. Tonight, there is a second entry into Norman Foster's work, which is the sky. I'm very happy that this is the subject of the lecture tonight, because I realize that rethinking of his works, that he literally liberated the field of architecture by looking at the sky. Remember the sky-break house in the 60s already, bringing natural light into the building, the Stansted Airport, of course. In the 80s, that became a model for all future airports, how the sky is integrated into the building, the Reichstag in Berlin, and the Great Court at the British Museum. And of course, the skyscrapers, the performance of the structure going high, and the elegant Viaduc de Milo. And recently, also, the pavilion in the Vieux-Port de Marseille. Here, we are integrated into the sky with this ceiling that reflects us with this beautiful mirroring effect. So there is no risk to be too epic with Norman Foster. Sky is the limit. Today, robots, drones, colonize our sky, and we need to address the problem. Solutions will come with and from architecture. We are eager to follow this development, being part of the work of Norman Foster. I will pass now the floor to my friend Jonathan Ledgard for the Red Line project, and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cyril. And thank you also to University President Patrick Erbischer, who has kindly supported and believed in this project from the start. He would very much have liked to have been here. In my work here at EPFL and as a novelist, I tend to wonder at the scale of living systems. This orb, this planet, this limited living space of ours, soil, sea, sky. And this, I think, beyond his extraordinary generosity and his capacity as an architect, is why I have such admiration for Norman. Norman thinks in living systems. And I believe the work we have done here together to present the first concept of an affordable drone port in Africa is an impressive example of that. So thank you, Norman, for making Red Line the very first project of the Norman Foster Foundation. Thank you also to my friend Narinder Sahu, a senior partner at Foster & Partners, who has been a co-visionary on Red Line from the start. We have a long way to go, money to be raised, flying robots also, community partnerships to be established, but tonight is a small step which might yet at some future point be seen as historic. I want to rapidly go through a few points on the Red Line project, which has been incubated, as Cyril said, for 2 years here at EPFL under my somewhat futurist Afrotech project. Any of you who are interested, students, professors, financiers, please send me a note through my EPFL email. Okay, 4 points. First, acceleration. We already saw this picture. This is a photograph of the city of Nairobi in the year 1905. The tents that you can see in the middle were the workers' camp for the railway. This city now has 4 million people. Everyone, most people here know that Africa is a very youthful continent. Some people know that 51% of sub-Saharan African countries are under the age of 19, and this is what youth looks like. Africa does not have an industrial base. And speaking as a former economist, we can say it's very likely it's not going to have one. The only possible happy economic future for many African communities is in the efficient sharing of capital goods. And that means moving things around faster, cheaper, and more accurately. Second point, connectivity. This is the Nokia 1100 mobile phone. 47 million handsets of these Nokias were bought in Africa. It is the single reason that I'm standing here today. The Nokia 1100 showed us that it's possible to produce advanced technology and push it even into the poorest communities. It demonstrated to me personally what I believe is the paradox of this century, which is that a household might have access to a robot before it has access to running water. This is a very difficult point to intellectualize, but I believe a profound one. Third point is disconnectivity. So we can say that digitally we are connecting, but physically we are going to remain quite disconnected. In Africa, as you can see on the map, there is not likely to be a transcontinental motorway. There are not enough tunnels, not enough bridges, and we believe that our borders are actually closing these days rather than opening. So again, there is a pressure. The final point I'd like to make is one of convergence. It is inevitable, I believe, on a crowded planet with limited resources, that we will make more intensive use of the sky using flying robots to carry precious cargo. Africa will be the first to do that, and Africa stands to benefit the most. I believe it is possible to save lives and build economies in Africa and beyond by putting blood, medicine, spare parts, and eventually the entire e-commerce chain up in the sky. It seems fanciful, but it is only really, as we can see, a spectral railway in the sky. And Norman, this picture is for you because, as you probably recognize, that's the Liverpool to Manchester Railway, the very first railway line in the world, or as you would probably prefer, the Manchester to Liverpool Railway. That was a project of extraordinary audacity, and that is the spirit that we are tapping into here tonight. So Norman, again, thank you so much for your time and for your efforts, and thanks.
I find it very difficult to separate my passions for flight and architecture. And in 1975, I became an owner in this aircraft. And at the time, in a similar talk at the University of East Anglia, I described this as beautiful, if not more beautiful, than a Brancusi. In that year, with another pilot, it's a two-seater, we set a record for time, for speed and distance, and over 300 kilometers with no engine. We cruised at an average speed of 90 kilometers an hour. But the whether it's architecture in the sky, architecture of the sky, I realized that when Jonathan offered this as a title, that the capturing of the sky, the embracing of nature and the symbolism of the sky was something that over 50 years had permeated my world of architecture, from the very first sketches through to a finished building, that it was evocative of light and lightness and suggested in harnessing the forces of nature and working with nature, the quest for a greener, more sustainable architecture. And in a way, the ideal building would be something like a tree. It would breathe and it would respond to changes in the seasons, the heat, the cool. It would also be inspirational as a structure. The way in which it cantilevers, sits in the landscape, is at harmony with the landscape, but reaches out hydraulically and absorbs the carbon dioxide in the air. So something that is beautiful, is highly functional, and all these kind of merge into one totality. And it occurred to me that many of these metaphors come together not in a building, but in the Millau Viaduct that was mentioned earlier. Millau Viaduct doesn't absorb carbon dioxide, but it certainly has a very sustainable story. And it is also related to the landscape and is evocative of flight. It really does penetrate the clouds, quite literally. It's a ribbon 2.5 kilometers long, vast spans, but very, very slender structure. It's tree-like in terms of its cables. The color of the cables is very much the color of the sky, a very conscious design decision. It's about transparency, it's about locking into the view. It's a humanistic vision of what infrastructure might be. And it has quite interesting its own story in terms of the way that it performs. In scale, the tallest of these columns is something like 17 meters taller than the Eiffel Tower. It creates a shortcut. Before this viaduct, you would have a tailback of some 35 kilometers with 5-hour delays going through Millau, going through the local region, instead of being able to leap across the great valley. And if you consider that something like 1,500 trucks cross this viaduct daily, and the journey time between Paris and Perpignan is reduced by 1.25 hours, then that translates into something like 36,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide, which are saved. So the analogy with the tree is in many ways quite apt. The way in which it relates to the landscape, it touches the ground very lightly, very delicately. It's that vertical cantilever. It's the minimum imprint on the landscape. And the flying insect, the grasshopper, again, is symbolic of that. So whether it's a massive piece of infrastructure or whether it's a small table, the way in which it relates to the ground is actually a kind of continuum. And it was once the idea of the sky as a generator, which embraced all the projects which I've been associated with, encouraged me to look at some unbuilt projects. And this little sketch is of one of several pavilions that were conceived for the Fred Olsen organization in the 1970s, the early 70s. And the site was a forest. And many of the much larger buildings, the skyscrapers and so on, all the principles are here. Reflectors which pull sunlight deep into the building in the low winter sun, hovering over the forest floor and extracting cool air and working with nature, reducing the high energy consuming traditional air conditioning systems. And again, just sitting very daintily in its forest setting. An earlier project, still a project from the 1960s, the Skybreak House. Its relationship to the landscape is much more of the landscape. It grows out of a slope, contained between two houses in a residential area. So it focuses the views, and you have the kind of poetry of feeling that you're not in an urbanity, but basically it's about the sky and it's about the distant views. And this steps down the hill, as you can see here, growing out of the landscape. And if we take a slice through that building as a cross-section, then again, the early sketches, the sky is a dominant, and when that's translated into a building, it is, again, very much at harmony. And those sketches, whether it's for a small home or whether it's for a major office complex, the Willis Faber building, also of the 70s, and the concept sketches, when translated, are very much about moving up towards the sky, embracing the sun, creating landscape on the roof. And this becomes a transparent building at night. But during the day, again, it engages with the clouds, with the sky, and with its urban surroundings. And those principles of an ecological, low-energy building, a building that would be humanized and brought alive by its dialogue with nature. This is the concept sketch for the Sainsbury Centre, an arts complex and a gallery for the extraordinary collection of the Sainsbury family. And it is very much a kind of light box. And it can control the light, so it could be blacked out in the way that this space is here, or it can embrace the light. And again, talking about light and lightness and the kind of theme of flying machines. Rather amusingly, on the occasion of my 60th birthday, the Sainsbury's presented me with a drawing by an artist. They were going through a rather difficult period at the time. I think it was a period of student unrest, and the building wasn't being as well received at that time as it has been since. So this artist suggested rather whimsically that it was so light the helicopter could come along and take it somewhere else. That theme led to, in the late 1980s, what you might call the reinvention of the airport terminal as we know it. And this was pretty typical at the time of that commission. And I remember Norman Payne, who headed out British Airports Authority, an engineer, at the time saying he felt it was time to create a new generation airport. And to achieve that, what we did was literally to turn this diagram upside down. I mean, this is a solid roof. It's full of ducts and machinery, heavy equipment. It's pretty closed. You don't know where you're going. It's disorientating. It was typical of the airports of that period. And if you took a diagram of that, then you have a kind of roof structure which is more bridge-like, solid. On the left at the top, you can see what that roof would look like in terms of its equipment, and the space below, which was pretty soulless. Also quite high energy consuming, because if you're blocking out the natural light, then you need artificial light. The artificial light generates heat, therefore you need cooling, all very expensive and high maintenance. And the solution was to, as I say, turn it upside down, put all the heavy equipment where it sits more comfortably on the ground rather than up on the roof. It's also easier to get at. And once you bring the light in, then you have a totally different experience. So it really is harmonizing with nature, it's working with the sky, it's reducing energy, and it's producing a more joyful place where you really can see the elements and see the aircraft that you're going to. It crossed my mind that, in a way, the cantilever is emblematic of modernity. And there are interesting parallels between the early passenger-carrying aircraft, the biplane, which was a bridge-like structure, and the Stansted kind of breakthrough is very much, again, a kind of a celebration of the cantilever, and something we take for granted in terms of modern aircraft. And if one elaborated this theme further, then at a particular point in time, you'll see that everybody is doing the cantilever steel tubular chair, for example. So I think it is it's very symbolic in the way that this diagram of Hong Kong Airport, if Stansted was revolutionary, then our airports that follow up to a certain point are evolutionary, in the sense that Hong Kong, almost looking like a flying machine itself, 500,000 square meters, 1.2 kilometers long, they improve on the model. They refine it, they develop it, rather in the way that artifacts like a phone may be revolutionary, and then you get a series of additions, it improves the performance, perhaps the appearance, offers more facilities. And Hong Kong, if I took on that very, very thin part of the building which recedes into the distance, if we were in there, we would see that the light and the structure were harmonized, were integrated, and were leading us towards our destination. So all very much about capturing the sky, capturing the sun, working with the elements, and also that sense of orientation, what I call an analog experience in a digital world. And again, the aircraft in the distance is also symbolic in its enlarged version, as Jonathan said, you've done the biggest in the world, now you can do the smallest airport in the world. And this, Beijing, is the largest in the world currently. And it magnifies Hong Kong by a factor of 3. It's 3.25 kilometers long. It's 1.5 million square meters area. And again, it is almost evocative of a flying creature. And interestingly, in the local kind of folklore, it's not just about capturing the sky, but it's also referred to as dragon-like in its appearance, whether it picks up on the tradition of the colors of the Forbidden City and integrates those colors that we most associate China with, the range of reds through oranges, through yellows, through golds. So those colors permeate the project and color, almost literally, the sky, which is the great umbrella over these vast spaces. But the building is actually interestingly referred to by those who use it as really very comforting. So although it's very large in scale, you compare this building with, say, 5 or 6 terminals at a Heathrow or a Kennedy, and with an internal rail, then it is very, very comfortable. It's at this point of the evolutionary kind of cycle of airports that I questioned whether the next move might be to take away the columns and take away the idea of a roof and walls and connections to the aircraft, all being different components, different languages, and questioned whether it wouldn't be possible to create one seamless kind of umbrella which would curve, arch, at one point become the roof, another point become the walls reach out and connect with the aircraft. Something that would be more organic. Could, for example, the more traditional 36-meter span between these columns, could that be 100 meters, 170 meters? And Mexico Airport, which is smaller than Beijing, but larger than Hong Kong, somewhere in the middle, a competition that we won last year, and is now under intensive design development to break ground early next year. You can see here the kind of heroic span, the way in which that membrane comes down to the ground. And we're studying this as a project using the medium of film. And so I'm going to show a few clips of that. It's overtaken by time, but the spirit is unchanged. And so this kind of fly-through shows the generosity, the scale, the quality of light, the way in which the shell can become funnels which bring light and water to the ground. The spans are truly heroic. The largest span is 170 meters. Normally it's around 100 meters. And again, very much about the flow of people. It may well be a museum in spirit, may encourage artifacts from the collection of the Museum of Anthropology. So it has many themes and ideas which currently flow through the project. But these are rather designed tools to develop the concept, along with full-size elements which we look at and which we prototype as we move along. That seemingly abrupt leap, kind of jump from the earlier generation of airport development to the Mexico one was informed by a body of work outside of the world of airports. And very much as was mentioned earlier, Bucky, who I collaborated with, worked with for the last 12 years of his life, was always referring to the world of nature, doing more with less, and the influence of nature and its structures on his work, which was very much about the Dymaxion, the geodesic structures. This is the 1967 Montral Expo. And those find a resonance in a number of our projects which explore large span, lightweight structures, which are very much about modifying the quality of natural light. What you will not pick up on this is that this roof is very, very efficient in terms of cutting down solar heat, solar gain. It has a series of paint dots on the surface, so it's about 70% opaque. You would only know it if you took one of those panels out and you could see the real sky beyond. But that line of development here in Washington, in the Smithsonian, and here at the Reichstag. And the Reichstag brings a number of these themes together, capturing the view, bringing light, bringing the sky, literally reflecting the sky right down into the heart of the assembly area itself, the political focus. And here you can see the way in which the reflector brings that right down into the body of the building. But also there's a very strong agenda of sustainability behind the project. So it harnesses the sun through a series of devices, through geothermal, through biofuels, renewable energies, photovoltaics, natural ventilation, and that capturing of the sun and the idea of the sun and the sky driving a building complex. It's probably taken right now to its most extreme in one experiment in the desert in Abu Dhabi, which is the Mazda project. And here, this 10 megawatt energy field, 22 hectares in area, is driving, with a lot of surplus energy fed back into the grid, is driving the first third of the Mazda experimental project, which is a project devoted to a university. There are 500 students there, 100 teachers, and that is exploring the whole world of solar. And I didn't know quite whether here, working with Johnny Cox, who heads out our film unit, and Narinda, and we discussed and said, should we show the film that we made to communicate the idea, or should we show it actually as it is now? And the decision was made to mix it all up. And it's quite interesting. I find it very difficult to separate out the reality from the simulations and the visualizations. But the combination of the two, I think, capture the spirit of this desert community, which again uses the materials of the area. It has robot cars which may drive from the outside. Here you can see the robot cars and the multi-layering. So the lower area is designed for mobility, and the upper area is for pedestrians and scaled accordingly. So here you get glimpses of the student accommodation, you get glimpses of the two types of buildings. One is about the university and the other about residences. They explore new materials, new concepts, wind towers, and here we morph into the reality as it is today. Quite a thriving community. Again, local materials. The red you see is the red of the sand of the desert, and a number of explorations which are ongoing. Those are the students already there. This is the building. These are real, but then these are not real, but they could be. So it is about exploration, experimentation. It's an investment in a future for this oil-rich country, in a future which will not necessarily be oil-rich and depend on newer, cleaner technologies. So again, very much a kind of living experiment. That was only possible by applying the lessons from native indigenous architecture in the desert before an age of cheap energy. So it came out of studying settlements like this, and also the way in which, in a previous age, hundreds of years, centuries back, they would be able to capture through domestic-scaled wind towers the cooler desert breezes and modify the temperature together with vegetation, courtyards. So these early communities were, in effect, reaching for the skies, rather in the way a medieval development like San Gimignano in Italy again would be kind of mini skyscrapers. So I don't find it surprising that in cities like Chicago, which are totally flat, you have this kind of convergence of vertical buildings. This is one of my favorite images, so it's an excuse really to show it, because I love the aircraft and the fact that it's flying along the New York grid, and in the background is one of my favorite buildings, which is the Van Alen Chrysler building of 1931. And in a way, if you take these early skyscrapers, they established a typology which up to relatively recently was absolutely fixed. If you were going to do a skyscraper, you did a central core and you had peripheral space, a kind of corridor around the core. The core would contain the staircases, the elevators, the washrooms, and so on. And it would also act as a structure. But essentially, it blocked the view, it blocked the sky. And if one kind of took that apart and you sought to reinvent the typology of a high-rise building, then really what you try and do is you try and take that core out of the center and is exactly what we did on Hong Kong, to split it and put it like bookends on the side. So all of a sudden, you've got free, flexible space, which is much better to look out on, to capture the view, and also enabled this bank, the only one of its kind, to be able to put a dealer floor which needs unbroken space for good communication. So it's very much about the social dimension as well. And talking about those reflectors in the Vestby building, in the Norwegian forest with the reflectors, then that idea resurfaces here. And you see that there is, on the one facade, there is this mirror that captures the rays of the sun. And on the right-hand side, you can see the way in which it illuminates not just the main space of the banking hall, but the pedestrian space below it. And here, looking down, you do actually see the quality of light which illuminates that. And interestingly, the floor of the bank becomes almost like a community centre at the weekends. And we have since developed many variations on that theme. And the next move was in Frankfurt for the Commerzbank. Instead of creating 2 towers, to create 3 towers of cores, and to spiral gardens around that, and to relate those gardens as lungs for the building, rather like the tree that I showed at the beginning. In other words, the ideal building would breathe, and it would work with the seasons. And that is the building here, and the big steps, the kind of cuts into the facade where the gardens. And so this is the first ecological skyscraper in the sense that it is using natural ventilation for something like 70% of the year. And if those were gardens that interrupted along the height of the building with a central atrium, then the next step was to explore the idea of a spiraling garden that would go around the perimeter of a building, and that would be like the lungs, so the spiraling lungs rather than the central atrium. Again, a whole series of experiments to explore the potential for the reinvention of the tall building. And unusually, the pinnacle of this building does, unlike a conventional tall tower where you go to the top and you find all the machinery, the equipment which drives the building, here it's very much about the view, about 360-degree horizon, and of course the clouds and the blue above. Again, those principles taken in another form atop a historic base in Manhattan, the first LEED accredited building in New York, very green agenda. And here the core is taken again from the center and put on the outside edge. And in the spirit of those Dymaxion geodesic structures, triangulated structures, this is saving something like 20% of steel, and the cost of steel relates to the cost of the building, and the steel is recycled. So it is a very green building which sits in a way quite gently on its site. And when you're in the base, it's very difficult to realize that you have the kind of monumental load of a building above. So that idea of a structure which will be very delicately related to its site, probably the most extreme example of that is the Collserola Tower that we did in Barcelona at the time. Oops, excuse me, leaping all over the place there. And not intentional to create a kind of space-age quality to it, but at least one very interesting Spanish magazine, AV, from time to time has, over the years, picked up on the kind of analogy between space and the buildings and the kind of lunar dimension. And on the right-hand one, that was provoked by the Apple building, which is a kind of, you see as a flying saucer in the distance there. And it would be very easy to imagine that that was a kind of one-liner as a circular building. But it did actually grow out of a very long period of gestation with Steve Jobs, where we questioned the very nature of a creative campus in California. And this red line is around the site that he acquired from Hewlett-Packard. He had very close association in his early career with the founders of Hewlett-Packard. So there was a rather nice twist that he would get this site. And typically here, if you could go close up to it, you would see it's mostly probably about 16 or 17 buildings as individual buildings in a landscape of asphalt and cars. And Steve, who remembered this area of Cupertino as being the kind of fruit basket of the United States with orchards, citrus fruits, and so on, really wanted to capture that landscape. And together, the idea of a single large building, but in relative terms, creatively, it would have everybody under one roof. So it would be great about internal communication. And that was evolved through deconstructing a circle, creating an edge building, and eventually kind of morphed into, over quite a long period, many months, finally emerged as this single building. Something like the outer circumference is probably about 1.6 kilometers. It's a third of a kilometer across in terms of its central part. But the site of 76 hectares, 80% of that is landscaping. It's a pleasure garden. And this is how it was last week. This is an up-to-date photograph. But the popular press, every time this building is referred to, it's always about cleared for takeoff, like a spaceship. Spaceships, liftoff for Apple, spaceship is landing. And I've really reflected on why that is. And there are recurring symbolisms, the space colonies that were envisaged on the right in the 70s, in the early period of NASA, was all about circular, and 2000 and whenever it was, the Space Odyssey, the Kubrick film, was again that theme. And Alexander Graham Bell, with his wonderfully structured, anticipating Buckminster Fuller and people like Barnes Wallis with his circular kites, again, all kind of evocative of flight. And somebody drew my attention to this recently and said, did you know that Cupertino, that the patron saint of Cupertino, which is a small town in Italy, patron saint is St. Joseph, and St. Joseph was known for his ability to lift off and hover above the ground. And here is a contemporary rendering. So I think that maybe those space references are rooted in something that goes back in time and spirituality. So there's Joseph, and a latter-day Joseph here is blasting off into space. And this is our project, which we did in collaboration with the European Space Agency. And it's how you put a habitation on the moon. And the principles are that you take out to the moon equipment that will work with the material of the moon itself, the dust, the regolith it's called. Closest you can get on Earth is volcanic dust. So it takes out a 3D printing machine with liquid, which is a binding agent, mixes it all up together, and then creates this protective environment. And you can see that the airlock is the thing that arrived and carried the 3D printer. And here you can see those 3D printers crawling around, making new dwellings. And this is truly a hostile environment. I mean, it's plus 100 degrees centigrade down to minus 170 degrees centigrade. And you have to contend with flying meteorites, very, very small, but 10 times the speed of a bullet. So having the equipment and this enclosure is something like 1 meter deep, and that is informed by a study of the cellular structure of bones. So it's incredibly strong. And the thing that I found fascinating was the absolute strong connection in terms of the concept and the way in which the habitation is created with the African drone project. And so if you're looking down on Earth from the moon and you see continental Africa, then as I'll describe, the principles are almost identical. Working with the material that is available, using a high technology form of transportation to take some bits together which you assemble, but instead of robots, you want as many people as possible employed in the project. And why do you want to do this? Well, if you look at this network here, 33%, 1/3 of the inhabitants live within 2 kilometers of an all-season road. Now that's fantastic until you see what an all-season road looks like. And Narinda headed out a project, and this was a very important experience for this drone project, the drone port project. But I haven't gone into it in detail. I haven't really shown it at all. But very, very important lesson. So here's Narinda getting to his school to teach a drawing class in Sierra Leone. And this is an all-season road. You can talk about it later. This is Narinda getting to his school on the main road, the main highway. And there he is. So imagine that this is delivering vital medical supplies. How do you shortcut? How do you leapfrog infrastructure? If Africa is 1.2 billion people now, and by 2050, it will double in size, 2.2 billion, and 1 in 4 people will be African on the planet. And by that 2050, 70% of humanity will be urbanized in cities. And that, I think, raises all kinds of interesting questions. Jonathan photographed this note about this poor child who died waiting for blood, 6 years old. And this is the hospital report. And why blood? Because in a year in Africa, the figures are there, 450,000 from malaria, all blood-related, which 100,000 from sickle cell disease. And of course, this drone network could be transporting blood, but it could also be transporting the vaccines, which will protect against the sickle cell disease. And it's interesting, the incidence of that disease is shown by the degree of darkness of the red. And Rwanda there, which is the country, the one of 54 countries, interestingly, all those 54 countries in Africa together produce about the same amount of energy as Spain, and the 60,000 who die from bleeding during pregnancy. So the concept of Redline is a drone which is a 3-meter span, has a payload, and that payload could deliver, amongst other things, but it could deliver 20 adult blood transfusions. The blue line, when you double the wingspan, interestingly, the payload goes up by a factor of 10. So Blue Line could deliver, just like the components that made the buildings on the moon, could deliver the components that enable the drone ports to be built by local labor, and creating a legacy that goes beyond. This is the lake which is closest. I think it's Kibu is the name of the lake, and Kibui, the nearest place, which you can see there, is 1.9 million people. So if Rwanda's population is 11 point, round figures, 8 million, then this is covering 44% of the population. So this first network of 3 drone ports by 2019 will serve 44% of the country's population. And you can see its relationship to the district hospitals and the thickness of the line. The thin red lines are the limited range of the smaller drones, and the other ones are the longer range of the larger drones. But Narinda's experience in Sierra Leone led him to, I think, add in with Jonathan and Jonathan's extraordinary depth of knowledge and experience of Africa to the idea that the drone port would not just be about drones. It would be a catalyst, and it would bring together a whole range of possibilities, from civic events, local businesses, tech hub, post office. It would provide employment, medical facilities, obviously, education, school, market, vaccinations, counseling, solar charging. So very much a network in its individual constituencies. And here, just to elaborate on that parallel with the lunar project, in one case it's a robot, in another case it's a workforce, it's a series of components, kit of parts, which enable the local available material to be processed into a building component. And here you can see the way in which the guide formwork is erected. There would be templates. The formwork itself would give the layout, the mapping for lighting, if that was in there, wiring, and the machines which would be distributed, delivered, as components assembled here. And this was the machine which was part of the story of the Sierra Leone school. And each one of these machines would cost $2,000. And with the binding agents, they enable these individual bricks, tiles to be created locally on site, and then with fast drying adhesives, minimum formwork, then very, very beautiful shells. Very much, if anybody knows others of my heroes like Gustavino in New York and his extraordinary creations. So this tradition of vaults which are locally made and very much of the terrain, so that when you see the color of this in the landscape, it is the color of the landscape. And as an earlier point right at the beginning, they touch the ground very lightly, so they're very permeable in terms of cross-ventilation, access, community. And I wasn't aware of it, but Narinder gave me a little story about elephants. And he said he was out with a trekker, and they're out in the wilds, and the trekker stopped them and said, "Just look at you, you're tiny. You make all this noise. Now watch this elephant." And the elephant goes past, and it's absolutely silent because the elephant touches the ground lightly. And the brick vault is coincidentally the same weight as the elephant. So learning more from nature. We are still exploring the shape of that drone port. And Narinder and Johnny, oops, I pressed, do you want to come and get rid of that signal for me? Got it. So I conclude with their film, which communicates some of the things that I've been talking about, and gives a kind of spirit for the architecture, the social agenda behind the building, and the beauty of the drones themselves. There's the Land Rover stuck in the road, and this is going to do its job in 1/12 of the time, that stuck Land Rover down there. And so here it's coming. As a pilot, I said, why would you have tall grass on the edges of the landing strip? And of course, if you overrun, you have a soft buffer. So the landscaping is also functional. And so here you can see the drone. The pod itself is removable, and that is the brains of the drone. That's programmed for the route. It takes the payload, and essentially probably high-tech plastic skinned foam, very light, bringing together the soaring abilities of a sailplane, but motor assisted. This could ride on thermal upcurrents, rather like the glider that I started the talk, that image earlier. It's running parallel with the lake. It can also overfly, parachute vital supplies down. The modules can be smaller. That's a reminder of the way in which the shortened time could very much save lives with fast deliveries, not just of blood and blue line, also in terms of vital components like replacing damaged parts for pumps, providing water. The social market dimension, and having a civic presence on the skyline. So more than just a utilitarian stance. So that really concludes Jonathan's vision of a future Africa. And as Narinder pointed out on the way over here, this is in its earliest stages, and in very little time, if this revolution takes off, then the sum total of drone ports on the African continent put together would make the biggest airport in the world look very small. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was an impressive journey. A lot have been said. I understand now why you changed the title from Architecture in the Sky to Architecture of the Sky. If you agree with this, can we continue with maybe some question? And yeah, I propose that because a lot have been said already, and we have the chance to have Narinder and Jonathan among us, we could focus the question, but we need more light in the room maybe, because we don't see. Can we have, yes, thank you very much. We could maybe focus the question, if you agree, on the red line, the three of us. And it's interesting because you have worked on it, and the project, it has a very early stage. And it could be very interesting because question can nourish also the project. So I invite you, if you have a question, there are microphone here on the room. Yes. If somebody has a question on this red line project, just presented by Norman briefly, because it's a very new project. It's the first time it was shown. Maybe because, yes, please.
Hi. One question. We saw you on the ground. What was the purpose of you being on the ground? Was it to try or to spend time with the people there, or?
Actually, it was. We're quite lucky as we share this kind of personal humanitarian ambition within a small group, but as a practice as well. And that trip actually started off as a holiday of mine with the charity Save the Children, to go and draw with children, give them a tool for advocacy. And as part of that, we couldn't help manifesting that research, if you like, into the built environment. So we did large murals with the children, drawing villages of the future and trying to find out what their aspirations would be in terms of the built environment. And when I came back and had a conversation with Norman about that, then that naturally kind of led into investigating new ways of building schools, clinics, in a quite a tough environment. So it was really hands-on research with an architectural lead to it, if you like.
Thank you. There another question? Yes?
Thank you. Just wondering, which country are you focusing on, and how much is this going to cost to get going?
I think all contributions would be welcome. I think it's your...
Thanks, Norman. Yeah, at the moment we are looking at Rwanda, and the president of Rwanda is offering us land and airspace. Rwanda is probably not the most at-risk nation. It does have a road infrastructure and a pretty good health system, but the Rwandan president, he's very, very forward-thinking. He understands in such a hilly, muddy country that eventually he will have a kind of blue line operation. So Rwanda looks a good bet. Then most of the East African countries, if you went to where Narinda was in Sierra Leone, you could hook up that country in 5 or 6 years, and that would have an unbelievable impact. So the main thing is to spend probably between $15 and $20 million piloting the technology to get Red Line up and running, and then we expect very big industry money if you can get the regulatory approvals and solve the technical problems. Then you're looking at a multi-billion-dollar industry at that point.
Thank you, Jonathan. Is there another question? Yes, here. Matthew.
I was just thinking of the legacy of this kind of thought in architecture, and of course directly related to the moment when Wright was working with Buckminster Fuller. He was also conceptualizing flying vehicles, and he drew them, of course, as helicopters. I was curious why you chose an airplane, which requires a port, rather than a kind of, many of the drones we fly around ourselves now, of course, are more helicopter-like in nature.
It's interesting. I had a whole collection of images that would relate to the drone. And even with experimental aircraft now, which are electric powered, and I picked up that the largest regional airline in America is on the point of placing a commuter aircraft order for its fleet, which is electrically powered, and has some resonance with the drones that we show here. I think that it's, I have a 14-year-old son, and we fly drones, and he's a kind of wizard with recreational drones, and they'll whiz up vertically and do all kinds of extraordinary things, including aerobatics. But I think that the challenge here, and there is a technical team working both here and in other institutions, and I think that the feeling is, in terms of the affordability and the range and doing more with less, that the combination of fixed-wing electrically powered with thrust sailplane type vehicles can take advantage of the rising up currents rather in the way that I described with that very first image. So it's very difficult to predict what form they will actually take. Obviously, it would be better in many ways if they just took off vertically and didn't need a landing strip. But then they would need much more power. Range would be severely limited. Higher maintenance. So at the moment, it's in the same spirit of the architecture. It's essentially seeking a simple route. I don't know whether you want to, because you're closer to this.
No, I think you hit all the main points there, Norman. It's really about price, ruggedness. I mean, you think about what we're trying to do is you want something which is like a Citroën de Chauveau, something which is tough, but kind of revolutionary. You can kick it around, so you have dirt on it, mud on it, but it's also going to be beautiful. I think one of the reference points about skies for me in this project is, as a species, we've only just begun to think about sky, the lower bit of the sky. And for this technology to get to massive scale, these craft have to be very beautiful, very quiet as well, you know. So you have to feel about them the way you felt about the crane or a heron. So you're either ambivalent or you like it. But drones can't drone, and you know, quadcopter or hexacopter drones are just probably annoying, apart from all the other points that Norman mentioned.
Thank you. Is there another hand? Lift. If I can, I have a question. It's purely architecture. I was surprised when I saw the first images how you use vernacular architecture to build for the buildings of the drone ports. And I realize also that, Norman, you are very renowned in high-tech architecture, but you very often relate to vernacular. It seems very important to you, even I think in your students' projects, when you learn architecture. And this question is also to Narinder and maybe Jonathan. How do you think this vernacular architecture is the way to build now in Africa, because it doesn't seem to be a tradition anymore? So why you choose this vernacular reference?
I think the fascination for me as a student, and I broke with the tradition of the school, which was Manchester University, where it was mandatory that you had to draw architecture every summer. You would measure a building. It was always a Georgian building, you know, high architecture. And I broke the tradition at great risk by measuring what I believed were the high technology buildings of their time, the vernacular, the great barns. And I avoided censure by the school because, to their surprise, it won quite an award at the RIBA, so they couldn't criticize me because, you know, it kind of worked. But that passion for what Bernard Rudolski would call architecture without architects, I find absolutely inspirational. And it's interesting that you find what we're showing here, vernacular. It actually would not be possible without combining the high technology of today in terms of materials, bonding agents, with the local soil. So, you know, these are elegant spans. I mean, if you compared them with what would be regarded as traditional in terms of rebars, concrete columns, concrete slabs, those would be the traditional architecture of that area. If you look at new schools, that's the kind of form that they take. So this, in a way, in its own way, is quite revolutionary. And I don't, you know, for me, that is as high-tech as anything in steel and glass. And for me, there's no conflict. They're the same story.
Thank you. So, well, thank you again. It was a great evening. Thanks to you, Norman, and Narinder, Jonathan, and all of you. We had a beautiful audience, and who remembered it for a long time. Thank you very much. Good night.